I've always loved the solitude of the woods. There's something about the endless trees, the smell of the earth, and the quiet hum of nature that feels right to me. I'm a woodworker by trade, and I take pride in crafting furniture by hand. Most of my pieces are made from local timber that I cut myself. That's how I found myself camping deep in the forests of northern Oregon one autumn night. It was 1998, and I was 32 years old, running my small business out of a shed behind my rented home. I'd scouted a patch of forest earlier that week, about 5 miles off a logging road, where I found a cluster of old maple trees with perfect grain for the table I was planning. I decided to camp out there for a couple of nights so I could chop and prep the wood without having to haul it back and forth. I loaded my truck with my tools, tarps, a tent, and enough food and water to last 3 days. The first day was uneventful. I found a flat spot near a creek to set up my camp. The trees towered above, their leaves beginning to turn yellow and orange. I spent most of the day marking and cutting smaller branches, letting the rhythm of the work guide me. By nightfall, I was tired but satisfied, with a decent stack of wood ready to load up in a day or two. The weather forecast had mentioned light rain, so I wasn't too worried when the sky turned gray that evening. I set up a tarp over my fire pit and cooked a simple dinner of canned stew. The drizzle started around 8 p.m., tapping softly against the tarp and the leaves above. It was soothing at first, a natural lullaby to accompany the crackle of the fire. But as the hours passed, the rain grew heavier. By midnight, it was pouring. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees and sending cold gusts into my tent. My fire had long since gone out, leaving me huddled inside, listening to the relentless drumbeat of rain on nylon. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Rain in the woods is normal, and I dealt with worse. But then I noticed something strange. Between the gusts of wind and the pounding rain, I kept hearing faint noises, sharp, irregular sounds that didn't belong. It was like the crack of a branch or the rustle of something large moving through the undergrowth. I tried to ignore it, brushing it off as deer or raccoons. But the noises continued, growing closer. It wasn't constant, just enough to keep me on edge. Every few minutes, there'd be another snap, another shuffle. I finally grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the beam into the rain-soaked woods. Nothing, just trees and darkness. I told myself it was my imagination, but I couldn't shake the unease. I decided to check my gear. If it was an animal, I didn't want it chewing through my food bag or damaging my tools. I pulled on my rain jacket and stepped out into the downpour, flashlight in one hand and my hatchet in the other. The rain was blinding, bouncing off the leaves and pooling on the ground. My boots squelched in the mud as I made my way to where I'd left my supplies under another tarp. Everything was untouched. No sign of any animal or anything else. I was about to head back to the tent when I saw it. A footprint in the mud. It was human, barefoot and fresh. I froze, staring at the print. It was bigger than mine, deep enough to show the heel and toes clearly. The rain was already starting to wash it away, but it was there, unmistakable. My heart started pounding. Who the hell was out here, miles from the nearest road, in the middle of a storm? I turned in a slow circle, shining my flashlight into the trees. The beam reflected off wet bark and dripping leaves, but I saw no one. The woods felt suddenly suffocating, the once familiar sounds of nature now menacing. I hurried back to my tent, my breath fogging in the cold air. Inside, I zipped up the flap and grabbed my hunting knife. I told myself it was just a hiker, maybe someone lost, but the fear in my gut told me otherwise. The night dragged on, every sound amplified by my racing thoughts. I barely slept, gripping the knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other. The rain eventually let up just before dawn, leaving the forest drenched and eerily quiet. When the sun rose, I stepped outside to find the ground littered with broken branches and puddles. I checked the footprint again, but the rain had washed it away. I spent the morning trying to convince myself it had been my own print, distorted by the mud. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I decided to cut my trip short. The wood could wait. By noon, I had most of my gear packed up, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I turned around, it felt like the trees were closing in, hiding something just out of sight. As I loaded the last of my tools into the truck, I noticed something else. A second footprint, this one near the creek. It was fresher than the first, and it hadn't been there the day before. My hands shook as I started the engine. I didn't look back as I drove down the muddy trail, the trees blurring past. It wasn't until I reached the main road that I let myself breathe again. I never went back to that spot. Whatever or whoever had been out there, I didn't want to find out. I've spent years working in the woods since then, but I always make sure to stick closer to home, never venturing too far from safety. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that footprint, about the strange noises in the dark. I tell myself it was nothing, just an overactive imagination. But deep down, I know better. Someone was out there that night and they were watching me. And for reasons I'll never understand, they let me go. I didn't join the army for glory or heroism. At 28, I was looking for direction, and the uniform offered stability and purpose. What I didn't expect was to find myself on a classified mission that would change the way I viewed the world forever. It was the summer of 2016, and my unit had been deployed to a remote area near the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. Officially, we were conducting surveillance on potential terrorist activity. Unofficially, we were intercepting smuggling operations, cartels moving weapons, drugs, and even people across dangerous terrain. The mission was straightforward: set up a camp in the mountains, monitor activity, and report back. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving. Rocky peaks loomed overhead, the valleys below choked with dense brush and narrow trails. Daytime temperatures soared above 100 degrees, but the nights dropped to near freezing. It was the kind of place where you could feel completely alone, even with a dozen men surrounding you. Our orders were clear: stay out of sight. We traveled at night, using moonlight and thermal goggles to navigate. By day, we hunkered down in a makeshift camp, camouflaged under thick tarps and branches. Every sound was scrutinized, every rustle of leaves, every distant echo. The weight of silence pressed down on us like the air itself. The camp wasn't much. For small tents for sleeping, a central area for equipment, and a perimeter marked with motion sensors and tripwires. We had enough food and water for 10 days, but resupply would require a helicopter drop, a risky move in this territory. By the 5th day, the tension was palpable. We hadn't seen any smuggling activity, but the signs were there. Boot prints in the dirt, cigarette butts half buried near the trails, and faint tracks from what looked like motorbikes. Something was happening in these mountains, and it wasn't good. It was just past midnight when the motion sensors went off. The faint beep in my earpiece jolted me awake. Grabbing my rifle, I crawled out of the tent, keeping low. Around me, the others were already on high alert, eyes scanning the dark terrain through night vision goggles. The sensor that tripped was about 200 meters north, near a narrow ravine. I volunteered to check it out, accompanied by Sergeant Miller, a grizzled vet in his late 30s. Together, we moved silently, our boots barely making a sound on the rocky ground. As we approached the ravine, the air seemed to grow heavier. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound almost deafening in the stillness. We found the sensor lying in the dirt, its small antenna snapped off. Nearby, fresh tracks zigzagged through the brush. Several sets of boot prints, along with deep grooves from what looked like a sled or cart. "Looks like they're hauling something," Miller muttered under his breath. We followed the tracks for about a mile, staying just inside the tree line. Finally, we saw them. A group of 6 men, heavily armed, dragging a makeshift sled piled high with crates. From a distance, it looked like weapons. We didn't engage. That wasn't our mission. Instead, we circled back to camp to report. The hike back felt longer than it should have, every shadow seeming to move, every distant sound amplified. Back at camp, the team leader, Lieutenant Carter, decided we'd monitor the smugglers until they left the area. We couldn't risk blowing our cover. Still, the discovery left everyone on edge. We doubled the perimeter security and rotated shifts for night watch. That's when things started to feel off. On my shift, I kept hearing faint whispers, like voices carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was the breeze playing tricks, but the whispers seemed deliberate, almost conversational. I scanned the area with my scope but saw nothing. The next morning, one of the motion sensors was missing. Not tripped or broken, just gone. By the 8th day, the tension had reached its breaking point. The smugglers hadn't left the area, and now we were the ones being watched. We found more tracks circling our camp, some less than 50 meters from the perimeter. That night, we spotted movement on the thermal scope, figures darting through the trees just beyond the sensor line. We couldn't tell if they were the smugglers or someone else, but they weren't approaching directly, almost as if they were toying with us. When the motion sensors went off again, we decided to act. 4 of us, including me, set out to pursue the intruders. We moved quickly and quietly, the darkness cloaking us as we closed the distance. But they were faster. Every time we thought we were closing in, the tracks veered off or disappeared entirely. It felt like a game, a sick, calculated game. Around 3 a.m., we stumbled upon an abandoned campsite. The fire was still smoldering, the smell of burnt wood hanging in the air. There were empty food wrappers, a few discarded water bottles, and something else, a blood-stained jacket. It didn't belong to any of us. We radioed back to camp, but there was no response. Static hissed through the earpiece, the signal inexplicably jammed. Panic began to set in. We were cut off deep in enemy territory with no idea what or who we were dealing with. When we finally returned to camp at dawn, it was deserted. The tents were shredded, equipment scattered, and the perimeter alarms smashed. There was no sign of the others. The tracks told a grim story, a struggle, blood stains in the dirt, and drag marks leading into the forest. Miller and I didn't speak. We didn't need to. We knew we were being hunted. We grabbed what supplies we could carry and set out for the extraction point, a grueling 12-mile hike through unforgiving terrain. Every step felt like it could be our last. The whispers returned, louder now, accompanied by the occasional snap of a branch or crunch of leaves. Whatever was out there wasn't hiding anymore. As night fell, we reached a small clearing. Exhausted, we decided to rest, taking turns keeping watch. But sleep was impossible. Around midnight, the whispers stopped. The silence was absolute. Then came the first shot. It whizzed past my head, followed by another that struck Miller in the leg. He collapsed with a grunt, clutching the wound. I dragged him behind a fallen log, returning fire blindly into the darkness. The firefight lasted less than a minute. When it was over, there was no sound, no movement. It was as if our attackers had vanished. I tried to radio for help, but the signal was still jammed. Miller's breathing was ragged, his face pale. I knew we wouldn't make it to the extraction point in time. At dawn, I left Miller in the clearing and pushed ahead alone. It was a cruel decision, but survival instincts took over. I promised myself I'd send help as soon as I reached safety. When I finally reached the extraction point, the helicopter was waiting. I waved them down, collapsing in the dirt as the rotors kicked up a cloud of dust. But when I looked back at the clearing, I saw them, figures standing just at the edge of the forest, watching. They didn't follow. They didn't need to. To this day, I don't know who or what they were, but I know one thing: I wasn't supposed to survive, and sometimes I wish I hadn't. I parked my car on the side of a cracked, narrow road somewhere deep in the heart of eastern Pennsylvania. It was late October of 2022, and the trees along the road had mostly lost their leaves, leaving behind skeletal branches that swayed gently in the cold breeze. The place I had chosen to camp wasn't on any official map. It was an old, forgotten mining site that I'd read about in an obscure online forum, a perfect spot for someone like me who sought solitude and adventure far from the well-trodden trails. The area wasn't marked by any signs or warnings, just a faint dirt path leading into the woods. I grabbed my backpack, double-checked my gear, tent, sleeping bag, flashlight, food, water, and a small first aid kit, and headed into the trees. The forum had mentioned an abandoned mining office deeper in the woods, supposedly still standing after decades of neglect. That's where I planned to set up camp. The hike to the site took longer than I expected. The trail was uneven, overgrown, and littered with fallen branches. Every few steps, I had to push through tangles of thorny bushes or duck under low-hanging branches. The further I walked, the quieter it got. No cars in the distance, no birds chirping, just the crunch of my boots and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. It felt isolating, but that's exactly what I wanted. After about an hour of hiking, I saw it, the mining office. It was a small, two-story building made of weathered wood and rusting metal. The windows were broken, the roof sagged in places, and graffiti covered the walls. A sense of unease crept over me, but I brushed it off. I'd come this far, and I wasn't about to turn back now. I circled the building, checking for any signs of recent activity. There were none. The ground around the structure was littered with shards of glass, rusty nails, and old metal tools, but no footprints or trash that would suggest anyone else had been here recently. Satisfied that I was alone, I set up my tent just outside the building, near a small clearing. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I lit a small campfire using the dry branches I'd gathered earlier. The fire's glow cast eerie shadows on the old building, making it look even more dilapidated. I sat by the fire, eating a sandwich and sipping water from my bottle, trying to shake the growing feeling of unease. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire. When the fire began to die down, I decided to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and turned off my flashlight. Darkness enveloped me, and the silence seemed even louder. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the faint outline of the tent's ceiling. Sleep didn't come easily. At some point in the night, I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, but then I heard it again, a faint metallic clanging, like something heavy being moved. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the sound. It was coming from inside the mining office. I told myself it was probably an animal. Maybe a raccoon or a stray dog had found its way inside and was knocking things over. But the sound wasn't random. It was deliberate, like someone or something was shifting through the debris. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. The cold night air hit me like a slap, and I could see my breath in the beam of the flashlight. I crept toward the building, my boots crunching softly on the frost-covered ground. The clanging stopped as I reached the doorway. I hesitated, shining the flashlight into the darkness. The beam illuminated broken furniture, rusted filing cabinets, and piles of debris, but nothing moved. I stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking under my weight. The air inside was damp and smelled of mildew. My flashlight revealed more of the same, junk and decay. I was about to turn around when I noticed something strange. A set of footprints in the dust leading further into the building. My stomach dropped. The prints weren't mine. They were too small and too fresh. I followed them cautiously, my heart pounding with every step. They led to a staircase at the back of the building. The stairs looked unstable, but the footprints continued up. Against all logic, I started to climb. The wood groaned under my weight, and I half expected the whole staircase to collapse, but it held. At the top, I found myself in a small room with a single broken window. The moonlight streaming in cast long shadows across the floor. There was no one there. The footprints ended abruptly in the middle of the room, as if whoever or whatever had made them had simply vanished. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when I heard it again. The metallic clanging, this time from outside. I rushed to the window and shined my flashlight into the clearing where my tent was. My blood ran cold. The tent was gone, not collapsed or torn apart. Completely gone, as if it had never been there. My backpack, my gear, even the fire pit were all missing. Panic set in. I scrambled back down the stairs, nearly slipping on the way, and ran out of the building. The clearing was empty. No sign of my things, no sign of anyone else. I stood there, turning in circles, shining my flashlight wildly into the trees, but the woods swallowed the light. I shouted into the night, hoping for some kind of response, but the only answer was the wind. With no other options, I decided to head back to the road. I didn't care about my gear anymore. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back was a blur of terror and exhaustion. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me jump, convinced that something or someone was following me. When I finally reached my car, the relief was overwhelming. I jumped in, locked the doors, and sped away without looking back. It wasn't until I was miles down the road that I noticed something in the rearview mirror. A smudge of dirt on the backseat window. It looked like a handprint. I don't camp anymore. It was one of those weekends where we all thought we needed to get away. Just a quiet trip into the woods, far enough from the city to escape the noise and chaos, but not so far that it felt like we were in the middle of nowhere. My husband, Matt, his brother Alex, and their mom, Carol, all decided that the weekend would be a good time to relax. We hadn't spent much time together in a while, and I was looking forward to the peace. We had settled on a small, somewhat remote spot by a creek in a forest area about 2 hours outside of town. The place wasn't exactly popular, but it wasn't unknown either. There were a few campsites scattered around, but nothing too close. It felt secluded, yet not completely isolated, which was exactly what we wanted. The sun was setting as we pulled in, casting long shadows through the trees. It was that perfect kind of evening where the air was still warm, but the evening chill had started to settle in. We spent the first few hours setting up camp. Matt and Alex set up the tent while Carol and I worked on getting the fire going. It was a simple setup: a small tent, a fire pit, and a couple of folding chairs scattered around the fire. We all pitched in, and by the time the sun dipped below the horizon, we had a roaring fire to sit around. The stars above were bright, almost too bright, as if the entire sky had been wiped clean of clouds. The first night was peaceful. We roasted marshmallows, laughed, and reminisced about old family stories. Matt and Alex got into some friendly banter about their childhood, and Carol and I mostly listened. The warmth of the fire and the cool night air felt good on my skin. I went to bed around midnight. The fire was still burning, but Matt and Alex stayed up a bit longer. Carol had already gone to her tent, and I was just starting to drift off to sleep when I heard something outside. It was faint at first, like the sound of footsteps crunching on leaves. I assumed it was just Matt or Alex coming back to the tent, but then the sound stopped. too suddenly. That moment of silence made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the wind or maybe an animal. Sleep didn't come easily after that. Every time I thought I was drifting off, I heard the sound again. Light footsteps, like someone was walking around our camp. My heart pounded, and I pulled the covers up tighter around my body. I wanted to call out, but I didn't want to wake Matt. I kept telling myself it was just the forest, but it felt wrong, unnatural. I finally mustered up the courage to step outside. It was dead quiet. The fire was just a few embers now, barely giving off any light. Matt and Alex's voices had long faded into the distance. There was no one around. The night felt too still, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the tree line. There was nothing. I stepped closer to the fire, trying to gather my thoughts. I had to be imagining things. I knew I had to be, but the unease wouldn't go away. I was just about to return to the tent when I heard it again, the footsteps. This time, they were closer. My heart nearly stopped. I froze, listening. The steps were soft but unmistakable, moving in a slow circle around the camp, as though they were trying to stay just out of sight. I rushed back to the tent, waking Matt. He didn't seem as concerned as I was, but he got up to check anyway. We listened for a while, but the sounds had stopped just like that. Everything felt normal again. Matt wasn't convinced that it was anything serious. He figured it might have been an animal or some other camper passing by, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next morning was bright and beautiful, and the forest seemed so peaceful again. The weird events from the night before were almost forgotten, just a distant memory clouded by daylight. We spent the day hiking along the creek and setting up a little spot for fishing. There was no sign of any disturbance, and I started to feel silly for worrying. But as the day wore on, things started to feel different. The woods seemed quieter than usual. Even the creek, which usually had that gentle, soothing sound of flowing water, was eerily still. Matt and Alex went off to explore a nearby trail, and Carol and I sat by the fire, the silence wrapping around us like a blanket. Then, out of nowhere, the ground beneath us seemed to tremble. It was subtle at first, just a faint vibration that made my skin prickle, but it grew more pronounced. Carol noticed it too. We both glanced around nervously. The vibration stopped, but the unease I felt earlier was back, sharper this time. I stood up, my gaze scanning the tree line. In the distance, I thought I saw movement. It was hard to tell, but there was someone, out there. The shapes in the trees were moving, though no wind stirred the branches. My stomach dropped. I had to tell Matt. He and Alex returned from their hike a short time later, and I explained what had happened. He laughed it off as if I was overthinking things. "It's just the forest," he said. "Sometimes, nature plays tricks on you." But something inside me didn't believe him. That night, the air was different. It was heavier, almost thick with tension. The moon was full, and its light seemed too bright. We sat around the fire once more, but this time, it felt like the fire wasn't enough to keep the dark at bay. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, and the forest around us felt like it was alive in a way I couldn't explain. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. Every twig that snapped made me jump. Around midnight, we all heard it. Something loud crashing through the underbrush. It was unmistakable. Something or someone was moving through the trees, fast and heavy. The sound was coming from just beyond our camp, so close that I could hear the leaves crunching underfoot. Matt grabbed the flashlight, and the beam of light sliced through the darkness, revealing only trees and undergrowth. Nothing. There was no animal, no person, just the eerie silence. We all sat there in disbelief. None of us spoke, each of us wondering if the others had heard what we did. And then, Just as quickly as it had started, the sound was gone. That night, none of us slept. Every little noise, every rustling in the leaves, sent us all on edge. The forest was full of movement, but nothing seemed to make sense. We kept our eyes peeled, watching every shadow, listening for the slightest noise. By morning, we were all on edge. We decided to pack up and leave. It wasn't until we started the long drive back that we realized none of us had seen anything out of the ordinary. There were no strange figures, no shadowy shapes in the trees. But it didn't matter. The fear had already taken root. As we pulled away from the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us the whole time. That trip stayed with me, hanging in the back of my mind. I knew that no matter how hard I tried to forget it, the woods had left its mark. It was late September, the kind of time when the days are still warm but the nights already hint at the winter chill. I had been planning this camping trip for weeks. I was tired of the constant noise of the city, the pressure of work, and the feeling of being constantly watched. I just needed a break, somewhere quiet, far from everything. I found the perfect spot on a map, a secluded place deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town. No one for miles around. I told a few friends about it, but they backed out at the last minute, citing too far and too remote. But I didn't mind. It just meant I'd have the peace I needed. I packed up my gear the night before and left early the next morning. The drive was long, 3 hours down a winding country road, then another hour on a dirt track, the kind that bumps you around in the car like a washing machine on spin cycle. The GPS cut out somewhere around the last 10 miles, and I had to rely on the rough map I had printed out to guide me. It wasn't too hard to follow once I started seeing the trail markers, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was getting more isolated with each passing mile. By the time I reached the campsite, it was just me, the truck, and a whole lot of trees. There wasn't a soul around. The area was surrounded by towering pines, thick enough to block the sun, making the place feel like an endless sea of shadow. The air was damp with the earthy smell of moss and decaying leaves. I unpacked my gear, set up the tent, and started a small fire. The crackling of the flames was the only sound breaking the heavy silence of the forest. The first couple of hours were peaceful. I just sat by the fire, letting my mind wander, watching the smoke twist up into the sky. The fire's warmth felt comforting as the day slowly faded away. The sun was setting fast, and soon the forest was shrouded in darkness. It was still early, and I didn't feel like going to bed just yet, so I pulled out a book. But after a few pages, I realized how quiet it was, unnervingly so. At first, I thought it was just the quiet of being in the woods, but the longer I sat there, the more something felt off. The wind had picked up, and the trees were creaking and groaning under the pressure, but there was no rustling of leaves like I expected. No animals scurrying about, no birds calling out. It was as if the whole forest had gone still. I tried to shake the feeling. Maybe it was just my nerves getting the best of me. After all, it was late, and I was alone in an unfamiliar place. The air was cool, and the fire was slowly dying down, so I decided to turn in for the night. I zipped up the tent and crawled into my sleeping bag, trying to relax, but the silence outside my tent was deafening. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like you were being watched, even though you couldn't see or hear anything. Around midnight, I woke up to a noise, something light, almost like a twig snapping, but loud enough to break the silence. My heart jumped, and I lay there in the dark, staring at the faint outline of the tent walls. I strained my ears, waiting for another sound. Nothing. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer maybe, but deep down I knew it wasn't. A few minutes passed, and then I heard it again. This time it was closer. Something outside was moving. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent just a few inches, enough to peer outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. The wind rustled the branches, but other than that, the night was as still as before. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was out there. I lay back down, heart racing, staring up at the tent ceiling. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. In fact, it only grew stronger. I eventually fell into a fitful sleep, but every little noise woke me. I tossed and turned, and each time, my eyes snapped open, expecting to see someone standing outside the tent. But every time, the darkness greeted me. It wasn't until the first light of dawn that I finally fell into a deep sleep, exhausted and anxious. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping and the gentle hum of the wind through the trees. The sun had risen, but the forest was still eerily quiet. I decided to get up, pack my things, and take a walk around to shake off the unease from the night before. The forest looked different in the daylight, less threatening, more peaceful. I walked for a while, enjoying the solitude, until I came across something that made my stomach drop. It was a small clearing, and in the center of it was an old, rusted metal trap, the kind used for catching small animals. It was half buried under leaves and dirt, but it was clearly old, decades at least. It didn't make sense. There was no reason for a trap to be out here in the middle of nowhere. I stepped closer to it, but before I could examine it any further, I heard a rustling behind me. I turned quickly, but no one was there, just the wind shifting the trees. My heart pounded, and I felt that same feeling from the night before creeping back in, the feeling of being watched. I quickly turned and walked back toward my camp, trying not to look over my shoulder. I spent the rest of the day keeping to myself, not venturing too far from the camp. As the sun began to set, I packed up my things and started the fire again, but I couldn't relax. Something about the place felt wrong, like it was closing in on me. I felt the eyes of the forest on me. The night was no different from the one before. I went to bed, but sleep didn't come easy. The sounds from the previous night returned. Light rustling outside the tent, soft and careful, like something moving around. I told myself it was just an animal, but this time I couldn't shake the fear. My mind kept racing, wondering if it was someone else. Someone who knew I was out here, watching me. Then, just before I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard a voice. It was faint, just a whisper, but it was unmistakable. My blood ran cold. I held my breath, listening, but there was nothing. No more rustling, no more voices, just silence. But I knew what I had heard. I wasn't alone. The next morning, I packed up and left the campsite in a hurry, not even bothering to finish my breakfast. I drove back down the dirt track, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The feeling of being watched didn't go away until I reached the main road, where civilization finally felt like a relief. When I got back home, I checked the news. There had been a missing persons report from the area I had been camping in. A hiker who had gone missing a few weeks ago. No one had found any sign of him. The thought of it made my stomach churn. Was it possible that I had been camping in the same spot where someone had disappeared? I don't know for sure, but that night, when I lay in my bed, I still couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there. Something had been watching me, and I couldn't help but wonder if I had narrowly escaped whatever it was that had taken the hiker. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. Just me, my gear, and the quiet of the woods. I decided to camp solo this time, something I'd done many times before, but this was different. There was something about the place, an old campsite nestled in the dense forest, deep in the mountains of northern Idaho, that drew me in. I arrived on a Friday afternoon with enough daylight left to set up camp. The air was cool and crisp, a clear autumn sky overhead. My boots crunched through the dry leaves, and I felt the peaceful isolation wash over me. The spot I chose was along a narrow trail that led to a small creek. The sound of the water rushing through the rocks was calming, a natural soundtrack to the evening I had planned. I set up my tent, hung up my food in a tree to avoid any curious animals, and made a small campfire. The flames flickered and crackled, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. The sun dipped behind the mountains, leaving the forest in a tranquil, dusky light. I cracked open a cold drink and settled by the fire, watching the embers glow. As the night grew darker, the temperature dropped. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and watched the stars begin to appear, their brilliance intensified by the lack of city lights. The fire's warmth was comforting, but the silence of the woods was unnerving at times. The sounds of animals, crickets chirping, leaves rustling, filled the air, but it was all far too quiet for my liking. I thought about how far I was from any civilization, how I was completely alone out here. But that's exactly what I had wanted. The first night passed without incident. I woke early the next morning to the sound of birds calling and the first light of day creeping through the trees. After a quick breakfast, I decided to go for a hike up the trail that led deeper into the mountains. The day was clear, with the sun shining brightly, and the forest felt alive, full of life and energy. I passed by the creek, the sound of water rushing over stones steady and comforting. As I hiked further, the trail became less defined, the trees denser. The feeling of isolation began to creep in again, but I pushed it aside. After all, I was a seasoned camper, used to the woods, used to being alone. I had always found solace in the wilderness. But as I went deeper, the air began to change. The further I went, the more still the forest seemed. There were fewer birds, fewer sounds of animals. It was like the woods had suddenly gone silent, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I stopped in my tracks and listened carefully. There was nothing, just the faint sound of wind rustling the leaves, but it wasn't the same. Something felt wrong. I shook it off and kept walking. The path was becoming less clear, and soon, I found myself in a part of the forest I didn't recognize. The trees seemed to crowd closer together, their branches thick with leaves, blocking out much of the sunlight. I pulled out my map to check my location, but couldn't find any recognizable landmarks. I wasn't lost, but I wasn't where I had planned to be either. I turned around to head back, but it felt like the air had grown heavier, as if the forest itself were pressing in on me. I picked up my pace, trying to stay calm, but the deeper I went, the less sure I felt. My footsteps sounded too loud in the silence, and every rustle in the brush made my heart race. I kept thinking I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I looked, there was nothing, just trees, rocks, and shadows. Then, just as I was beginning to feel panicked, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A footprint in the dirt. It wasn't a bear print or any animal track I recognized. It was too big, too human-like, but distorted. The toes were elongated, and the heel was deeply imprinted into the earth, like someone or something had been walking through the woods in bare feet. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't right. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I was far from any trail, far from the campground. The last thing I wanted was to encounter whoever or whatever had left that print. I turned and ran, my feet thudding against the ground, my breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. The forest seemed to close in around me, and I could hear twigs snapping behind me, as if something was following. I pushed harder, not daring to look back. I had to make it back to camp. It felt like I was running forever, but I finally burst into the clearing where my campsite was. The sight of my tent and the flickering campfire was a relief, but it didn't last long. There was something wrong. My food bag, which I had hung high in the tree, was missing, and the fire. There was something off about it, the flames flickering in strange patterns, almost as if they were being disturbed by some unseen force. I glanced around, trying to keep my composure. The forest felt different now, oppressive, like the very trees were watching me. I had always loved the quiet of nature, but now, the silence felt suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight. I quickly packed up my things, not caring about how haphazardly I did it. I needed to leave. As I shoved my gear into my backpack, I noticed something else. Footprints. Not mine, but new ones leading up to my campsite. They were fresh, and they weren't animal tracks. They were the same strange, distorted prints I had seen earlier. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath in the night air. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there, but as I turned to leave, I heard it. A low, guttural sound from deep within the woods. It wasn't an animal noise. It was something else. Something human, but not. I didn't look back. I ran. The trail out of the woods felt endless. I wasn't sure how long I'd been running, but my legs burned, and my lungs ached. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in as if they didn't want me to leave. But finally, after what felt like hours, I stumbled out of the woods, back onto the main road. I looked behind me one last time, half expecting to see something standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. But there was nothing. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck. I got inside, slammed the door, and locked it. The adrenaline still coursing through me, I drove as fast as I could, not looking back, not slowing down. I made it home, but I never went back to that campsite. And to this day, I can't explain what I saw or what followed me out of those woods. Some things are better left alone. It was early October, and I decided to take a solo camping trip. Something about the quiet, the cold air, and the isolation felt perfect for clearing my mind. I was in my late 20s, and after a stressful year, I wanted a weekend away from everything. No friends, no distractions, just me and the outdoors. I had found a secluded, lesser-known graveyard in the middle of nowhere in rural America. The area was surrounded by thick woods, with just a single road leading to it. I'd heard about it from an old post on a forgotten camping forum, where people spoke of its strange history, but I wasn't one to believe in superstitions. I figured it would be the perfect spot for a peaceful night under the stars. I drove for hours to reach the spot, leaving behind the noise of the city and entering the deep, quiet countryside. The sun was setting as I arrived, casting long shadows across the old, crumbling headstones. The graveyard was small, with only a few dozen graves scattered around. The cemetery had been abandoned for decades, with weeds and overgrowth reclaiming much of the land. I parked my truck just outside the iron gates, and I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in. The rusted gates creaked eerily as I pushed them open and made my way to the site. My plan was simple: set up my tent, enjoy some food, and sleep under the stars, surrounded by the stillness of the night. I found a clearing near the back of the graveyard. There was a flat spot between two tall oak trees, where the ground was soft but firm enough to set up my tent. I set everything up with ease, my hands working quickly as the last of the sunlight faded. Once my camp was ready, I built a small fire in the center, hoping the flickering light would ward off any unsettling thoughts. As the flames danced, I sat back, roasting some marshmallows, and thought about how nice it was to be away from everything. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped sharply. I zipped up my jacket tighter, trying to stay warm, but the cold only seemed to get worse. The wind picked up, making the trees sway and groan. I stared into the fire, feeling an odd sense of unease that I couldn't shake. The night was far too still for my liking, and every gust of wind through the trees sounded like whispers. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was being paranoid. But still, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It was around midnight when I first heard it. A faint rustling sound, coming from somewhere behind the graveyard. It was hard to tell where exactly, but it sounded like footsteps. I turned around quickly, expecting to see a deer or maybe a raccoon, but there was nothing, just the overgrown, tangled trees beyond the cemetery. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was probably an animal, and returned to the fire. But then I heard it again. This time it was closer, and it was unmistakably human. A shuffle, followed by a low, dragging noise. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood up, my eyes scanning the darkness. The fire flickered, casting long shadows across the graveyard. The air felt heavier now, suffocating almost. I called out, asking if anyone was out there, but the only response was the wind. I felt my pulse quicken. My first instinct was to grab my flashlight, which was sitting inside the tent, but a part of me didn't want to move. I stood frozen in place, listening to the soft shuffle that was getting closer. It was unmistakable now. Someone or something was walking around the graveyard. I told myself it was probably someone else camping nearby. Maybe it was another camper or a curious hiker. But then the sound stopped. Complete silence fell over the graveyard. I waited, feeling my heart thumping in my chest. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to move, to run, but my feet were glued to the ground. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly began walking toward my tent, trying not to make a sound. That's when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement between two tombstones. It was a shadow, a figure, but it was moving too fluidly to be a person. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The figure was tall, nearly 7 feet, with a strange, hunched posture. It was darker than the night around it, a deep black that seemed to absorb the light from the fire. I couldn't make out any features, but there was something about the shape that made my skin crawl. Without thinking, I darted toward the tent, my mind racing. My hand fumbled with the zipper, and I finally managed to get inside, locking the flap behind me. I could hear the shuffling again, this time much closer, and I pressed myself against the wall of the tent, trying to stay as quiet as possible. For what felt like hours, I lay there in the dark, waiting for something to happen. The wind howled, and the trees creaked ominously, but there was no sign of the figure. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me from the darkness. Every now and then, I'd hear that dragging shuffle getting closer and then fading away again. I don't know how long I stayed there, trying to stay as still as possible. I was paralyzed with fear, my thoughts racing, my body cold with sweat. I kept thinking about the history of the place, the old posts I'd read online about people hearing strange noises, feeling like they were being watched, or even seeing figures moving through the graveyard at night. But none of it felt real. Not until now. Eventually, exhaustion won over my fear. I drifted into a restless sleep, my mind filled with twisted, disjointed dreams. I woke up with a start hours later, feeling the same heavy weight in the air, but this time, something was different. The fire was out, and the graveyard was eerily quiet. It was then that I heard it, closer than before, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, right outside the tent. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly reached for the flashlight. My fingers trembled as I clicked it on, but the beam barely cut through the dark. I held it in my hand, too afraid to move, as the footsteps grew louder. There was no way I could stay here any longer. I had to leave. I quickly packed up my tent, trying to stay as quiet as possible, but the sounds of those footsteps never stopped. They were all around me now. I couldn't see anything, but I felt the presence of someone, closing in. As I threw everything into the back of my truck, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A soft whisper, barely audible but unmistakable, coming from somewhere just behind me. I didn't hesitate. I slammed the door shut, started the truck, and peeled out of there. I didn't look back. As I drove away, I could still hear the sounds of the footsteps in the back of my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been followed. When I finally reached the nearest town, I stopped at a gas station, trying to calm myself down. I told the clerk about the strange experience, but all they said was that I wasn't the first to come through with a story like that. They mentioned the old graveyard and how locals used to avoid it. I never went back. I don't know what I heard or what was walking around the graveyard that night, but it felt real. Too real to ignore. The memory of it still haunts me,